The sanctions and tariff policies of United States President Donald Trump have led to a significant reduction in the import of Russian energy resources by a number of countries, primarily Turkey, as well as, to some extent, India and China. Trump is actively demanding that NATO countries and European states completely stop purchasing from Russia, and has threatened high tariffs for countries that do not give up Russian energy resources, or even from those energy resources that are then sent to countries such as, for example, India, Turkey, and others, where they are processed and then go further, not as crude oil anymore, but as petroleum products. At the end of 2025, Turkey began to significantly reduce its purchases of Russian oil due to new Western sanctions against the Russian oil sector and concerns about losing the ability to re-export fuel to Europe. They buy from Russia, process it into a petroleum product, and resell it. The European Union and the United States said they would not buy it and would even impose sanctions, so Europe decided to buy from other places. The country's largest oil refineries have increased their oil purchases in recent months, not from Russia, but especially from Iraq and Kazakhstan, to avoid the risks of these very secondary sanctions I mentioned. After the latest especially tough United States sanctions were introduced in October 2025, Russian oil exports began to decline quite noticeably. Russian companies Rosneft, Lukoil, and previously Gazpromneft and Surgutneftgaz came under sanctions. This is approximately 70% of Russian maritime exports. The fact that Turkey was buying oil brought Russia about $10 billion a year. India has slowed down its purchases of Russian raw materials, but let's say some Indian processing companies are very serious, some are less serious, but, for example, Indian Oil Corp., which is probably one of the largest companies, purchased only 5% of its usual volume from Russia in December, not 55%. Purchases in 2026 will likely be at least a third lower than in early 2025. Experts say that by the end of 2026, India will either stop buying oil from Russia altogether or will buy it, but not on a regular basis. Considering that India brought Russia $50 billion a year, this is a heavy blow to Russian export revenues. Immediately after sanctions were imposed on Russian oil, China reduced its purchases by 50%. Compared to the same period in 2024. If China now reaches an agreement with the United States on trade deal terms, Russia could lose this buyer as well. It has already lost 50%, and it could lose all 100 or at least 90. In 2024, China purchased Russian oil worth $51 billion. Losing half means a loss, losing billions. Losing 90% means losing $45 billion a year. In 2024, the European Union purchased oil and gas from Russia worth $24 billion. In 2025, purchases dropped to $5 billion, and in a year, maybe two at most, they'll reach zero. In the United Kingdom, which is separate from the European Union, it's $5 billion in 2024, and they plan to buy nothing more in 2026. So the total loss, according to what they say are conservative estimates, is $10 billion from Turkey plus $25 billion from India. If they stop buying half, that's $25 billion from China, half of the reduction, $30 billion from Europe plus England plus the European Union, plus $2 billion from Japan and South Korea. So Russia's losses will amount to $92 billion a year, or maybe even more, compared to 2024 and the first 3 quarters of 2025. Before Trump announced his sanctions, Russia's total income from selling crude oil and petroleum products in 2024 was $180 billion. Losing buyers worth $92 billion, which is half of the income, will significantly reduce profits if oil and gas revenues drop by $90 billion. Not far from that. Russia's budget deficit will increase by 5 or 7% of gross domestic product, which will lead to a sharp increase in taxes and fees, as well as an urgent reduction in spending. For what? For the war, ladies and gentlemen. To compensate for the falling revenues, the authorities are already planning, Russian authorities, I mean, are planning to raise value-added tax. Well, it's 20. Now we don't know how much it will be later. They say it will be 22, maybe 25. They will definitely expand the taxable base. What does that mean? That they will start collecting taxes from people who don't pay them today or pay little and will have to pay more. In addition, transportation and other fees will be increased. Even according to optimistic forecasts, these measures are not enough to balance the budget. In other words, many social programs, subsidies, and infrastructure projects will either be shut down or at the very least reduced. The loss of major oil revenues will cause a severe shortage of foreign currency in the country and increase pressure on the ruble. Without the influx of petrodollars, Russians predict the ruble exchange rate in 2026 to be 95,120 rubles per dollar. Well, excuse me, but it seems to me 125, 175, well, sorry, so to speak, I could be wrong. The weakening of the ruble will lead to a decrease in purchasing power, which will inevitably worsen the economic situation, and most importantly, the standard of living of the population. The standard of living of the population can be lowered up to sausage, vodka, and a piece of bread so that, well, to have a sniff and to pickle a cucumber, yes? But what if there's not enough sausage and vodka? That's when it will start, by the way. Well, all right. A structural crisis, a systemic blow to Russian, well, finances and the stability of the ruble, with inevitable taxes and social consequences. I hope I don't need to explain what that means. Well, yeah, with a severe financial deficit, a severe budget deficit, and a reduction in oil revenues, the authorities are forced either to tighten the screws. That's something we know how to do, right? That is, to increase control, introduce additional taxes, tighten policies. Tightening policies means making things stricter. We know what tightening means. After all, so to speak, from Putin to Stalin, there are still a few more steps to go through. Either they will cut taxes on social and propaganda projects, which could cause a loyalty crisis among the bureaucracy of the regional influence group. So depending on the budget, the internal debt, and new taxes, all sorts of social subtitles will start to happen. Upheaval. I don't want to say because I don't want to talk about what I don't know. Because how the Russian people will react to all this, nobody knows. Maybe they'll stay since vodka is cheap there, so let it be. Like in Rezigil, maybe only Moscow and St. Petersburg will be left and will live like that. Yes, to stay and take more. The others will begin to feel squeezed and pressured. That's it. Will there be protests? I don't know. The biggest protest I read about in Moscow was over some terrible issue. Up to 60,000 people attended. Some wrote, wow. Participants claimed 100,000, while police estimated 20,000. Foreign correspondents estimated 60,000 people there. The largest crowd, though I'm not sure how they counted. In Moscow, with about 10 million residents, the largest was in Puerto Rico, home to 3.5 million. When they had problems with their governor, 1.5 million people came out to protest. Here it was just 60,000. Nobody cares, yeah. Especially since, so to speak, the committee, the Federal Security Service, has all sorts of skills, let's say there. They're used to dealing with intellectuals. If the working class, those with nothing to eat, come out, we'll see. So a reduction in oil rent will decrease the ability to hold together, to finance foreign policy, foreign expansion, international projects, and to support allies, which is also very important. That means Russia's political influence on the international stage will decrease, and the destabilization will also affect the military machine, which, of course, is what Ukrainians are praying for. The loss of $90 billion in oil revenues threatens to shrink the resource base for maintaining power and supporting the elites. That's the most important thing. Just economic instability, so to speak, probably won't lead to protests. But the weakening of international influence and geopolitical positions largely depends on Russia's financial situation, and they will decrease. That is, loyal friends and partners will start looking for where they can go away from Russia. Will this lead to the need to change policy? Probably a revision of the key points of the governance model. Probably. Putin's regime has often been predicted to end, but as we see, it hasn't happened yet. What is clear is that Russia will have to reconsider its domestic and foreign policy, and I really hope that this reconsideration will lead to a decrease in the aggressiveness of the regime. How exactly should this affect the war in Ukraine and the support of terrorists of all kinds? Yes, so maybe Russia will decide to wage a positional war and spend less on it, since it doesn't require large expenses. Or it will start negotiations on how to end this war. In any case, it's much better for the world. By the world, I mean the planet, the whole world, for you and me. It would be much better if Russia didn't exist. Continued. Enough money to carry out its aggressive, bloody policy. Until next time, Editor Sanctions.